President Trump continues ratcheting up the pressure on Venezuelan dictator Nicolás Maduro, with the latest being a reported drone strike on an alleged drug loading facility on the coast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleague on the editorial page, America's columnist Mary Anastasia O'Grady. After dozens of strikes on alleged drug boats in the Caribbean, President Trump is now openly discussing what news reports say was a CIA strike inside Venezuela. News reports saying this was on a dock where American officials think that Tren de Aragua, a Venezuelan gang, had drugs and was preparing possibly to put them onto boats. Nobody was killed in the strike. The dock was not manned at the time. Let's listen to President Trump first at Mar-a-Lago discussing this with reporters.
There was a major explosion in the dock area where they load the boats up with drugs. They load the boats up with drugs. So we hit all the boats, and now we hit the area. It's the implementation area. That's where they implement. And that is no longer around.
Mary, what do you make of this? And how big of an escalation is this, a strike on Venezuelan territory reportedly versus these strikes on drug boats, which have been in the high seas?
The modus operandi here, the idea, the theory behind what Donald Trump is trying to do continues the same, which is Trump is trying to tell Maduro that he has the capacity to basically make him leave power through various forms of kinetic action. And he started with bombing the boats at sea. If this is in fact one of the CIA's actions, I think he's trying to show Maduro that he can actually operate inside of Venezuela without dropping bombs, by the way, that the CIA is active. He said in the past the CIA is active in Venezuela, and that they can carry out these kinds of actions against his government. And I think the idea is to indicate to him that it won't stop with a dock where drug boats are being loaded, but there are other places where the CIA is operating in the country. And I think the suggestion is that might even include places where he sleeps. So the idea is to convince Maduro that for the benefit of his life, he should leave office.
At the same time, the economic pressure being brought to bear by the U.S. also continues to increase. And Mary, some reports also that Venezuela is now shutting down oil wells, which is a difficult economic proposition because it's expensive then to reopen them. But that's the choice they're having to make because they are not able to get the oil flowing out of the country. How much of an economic pinch do you think this is becoming for the Maduro regime? And how do you think that plays into his calculations here?
It's definitely really tough on Venezuela. I mean, I was looking at where they get their money from, and most of it does come from oil. They also collect quite a bit of money by exporting illegal narcotics to the U.S. and also to Europe. And they also are involved in illegal gold mining in various parts of the country where they get a pretty good cut. But the largest single industry is the oil industry. And the oil industry is very broken down. At one time, the country was pumping something like 3.4 million barrels a day, and now it's less than 1 million. So they need that income. They work very hard to try to patch things up, but the infrastructure is broken down. Most foreign companies have left, so they have to rely on their own capabilities. For the most part, they do have Chevron partnering with this terrible regime, but otherwise they have to rely on their own capabilities. And so this is going to hurt them a lot. I would remind you that Cuba has been hurt worse than Venezuela is right now, and they stayed in power. So it doesn't mean they can't stay in power. I think the people who will suffer first and foremost are the majority of the population. But it is a big hit to the regime as well.
What's your read of the recent reports that Maduro is laughing off this pressure? So there's an interesting few lines in a journal news story. Let me just read this. In recent weeks, the 63-year-old leftist has been dancing on stage at rallies, calmly strolling trade expos and attending Christmas tree lightings hand in hand with his wife. He has serenaded supporters with dance remixes and offered up his own rendition of John Lennon's Imagine. Don't worry, be happy, Maduro said at an event in the capital of Caracas, wearing a sombrero and flashing a peace sign as he sang along to the Bobby McFerrin classic. Uh, Mary, what an image that is. Is that just trying to present a bold face for his people?
Well, I think he's being coached by the Cubans. And I mean, the Cubans provide a lot of security for Maduro. But I think he's also being coached by them in the sense that they say, look at us. We've been here for 67 years. They won't try anything. I've heard recently that Putin felt much the same way when he went into Crimea, that he told people, I knew I could do it because I knew they didn't have the guts or the will to stop me. And I think he's testing Donald Trump's will. I mean, he thinks, like the Cubans think, that he won't actually take that last step, which is to eliminate him. And as long as he stays there, he can outlast Trump. And, he knows that there's a debate inside the U.S. over whether Donald Trump has the authority to take aggressive actions against Venezuela. So he can count on that also. And I think that's where a lot of his bravado is coming from.
But on that point, do you think that by now President Trump has raised the stakes enough, both with these strikes on these alleged drug boats in the Caribbean, the deployment of some serious firepower from the U.S. Navy to the region, now this strike on what he's saying is a dock? Do you think that the U.S. has raised the stakes enough that one of these guys is going to win this confrontation and one of them isn't, that there's not really a way for the U.S. to de-escalate with Maduro remaining in power and without the U.S. suffering a serious blow to its credibility? I mean, maybe in the Western Hemisphere, but also across the globe.
I think that's completely accurate. I mean, I think this is a standoff between Maduro and Trump, and one of them is going to lose. And I find it difficult to think about how Donald Trump could retreat from the Caribbean and from Venezuela without damaging U.S. credibility. And it would also hurt people inside Venezuela who have taken great risks to stand up to Maduro. So I don't think there's any going back from this. I think the question right now is how will Donald Trump execute the last stages of this standoff? And we saw some indication of that with the strike on the dock. I mean, I think he will just continue to escalate until it seems too dangerous for Maduro to stay, and then he'll leave. But, one thing that's important to keep in mind is that if Maduro tried to leave right now, I think he might even be killed by his own people, because there's a lot of people who are willing to dig the flag in and stay put right up until the end. I don't think he's one of them. But right now, he doesn't really have a huge choice. So he's going with this kind of bravado, which, again, I think he's being coached by Russia and by Cuba to tough it out, because he knows Donald Trump is averse to risk and is unlikely to put boots on the ground in Venezuela.
And in the meantime, the regime is continuing to crack down on political opposition. You note this in your column this week, writing that on December 2nd, Caracas sentenced the son-in-law of President-elect Edmundo Gonzalez to 30 years in prison for terrorism. That column, if listeners want to find it, is under the headline, Venezuela and Cuba, What's Next? And go through some of the questions that you raise about what the aftermath in Venezuela might look like if the U.S. is successful at forcing Maduro out.
I think we've just been talking about how difficult it is to get him to leave. But I have a feeling that might be the easy part, because once he does leave, and presumably a lot of those people around him who are also executing his policy of terror against their own people will also leave, you will have to, find a way to, first of all, establish order in the country, and then secondly, administer to the humanitarian needs, because the country is very short of fuel, food, medicine, hospitals, water, all the things that make a society go. And they don't have an organizational structure. The good news in Venezuela is you do have Edmundo Gonzalez, as you mentioned, the president-elect who was elected last July. He has legitimacy, as does Maria Corina Machado, who just won the Nobel Peace Prize. She's very popular. And so there at least would be an elected government. If you got the military to take an oath to defend the government, you could basically stand up a government and start putting things back in place. I think you would need some transition period, in which case you need some lending, probably from like the World Bank or the IMF, or to help them get through the transition period. But Maria Corina Machado is very committed to free markets and investment and property rights and the rule of law. So I think they would have a skeleton to work with to sort of get the country going. Cuba is a much more difficult situation because Cuba is completely destroyed from top to bottom in every way. I mean, there's no really functioning civil society. There are Cuban churches, which might be helpful, but I think you would need an international peacekeeping force to go in there and to establish a set of rules to rebuild the political economy. And then, of course, followed by, at the same time, administering to the humanitarian needs, which are even more dire than they are in Venezuela, with high inflation, food shortages, no water, no sanitation, terrible epidemics of diseases like dengue fever. It's really in really bad shape. So you'd be starting from scratch there.
Mary, you mentioned some lending maybe, but one line from your column that jumped out at me was this: Venezuela doesn't need a Marshall Plan. And the reason I think that's interesting is we have obviously some fiscal and spending challenges here in the United States. The Trump administration and the MAGA movement is often skeptical of sending resources abroad. You've seen that in this shift in Ukraine, for example, away from U.S. military hardware donations to requirements that the EU and other allies purchase that military materiel and send it into Ukraine. And so that's notable to me because it does suggest, if you're correct, that a rebuilding of Venezuela would not require some kind of backing outlay from the taxpayers in the way that many people might suspect.
I put that line there because, as crazy as it sounds, over the last 25 years, people who seem intelligent in every other way have come to me and said, Venezuela needs a Marshall Plan. Are you crazy? They're sitting on the world's largest oil reserves. They don't need a Marshall Plan. They need the political will to establish property rights and a rule of law and make the country, which Maria Corina has said she wants to do, an energy hub for all of South America. It would explode with prosperity. But you need to have the will to do it. What I was trying to say in my column is, in the short run, there will be a period of transition because they've done so much damage to both the oil infrastructure, but also the institutional infrastructure. You have to rebuild a judiciary. You have to, have new elections for Congress. You have to build the institutions that are the pillars of a free economy. And they will take time to get those in place, be able to assure investors that if they make an investment in Venezuela, their property will be protected by the rule of law. And during that period of transition, I think they'll need to borrow money from probably international financial institutions, maybe the IMF, World Bank can help. But I don't think it has to be a burden that the U.S. bears.
But there are those countervailing forces that are in favor of that kind of real revitalization of the economy. I mean, the story that you're telling requires the kinds of things that we take for granted in the West and the developed world: property rights, the rule of law. There is that kind of movement for that transformation of Venezuela. Or, is it possible that even if Maduro fled, the resulting regime would be somebody of his coterie?
I think if he fled, part of the I mean, we do have a president-elect. He's living in exile in Spain, but he would return to Venezuela. He would be sworn in. Maria Corina would come out of hiding. And well, I guess right now she's not in Venezuela, but she would return. And if she had already returned, she would come out of hiding. I think what you're asking is kind of a cultural question, which is, you have so many years of the Venezuelans thinking that government was supposed to be the supplier of their well-being. And we're now suggesting through the ideas of Maria Corina that it's going to be limited government and property rights and free markets that's going to rescue Venezuela. I think it's a good question to ask whether the Venezuelan people are going to get behind that. But for now, she's very popular. She's been out there defending these ideas for years. And she would have been elected president if they hadn't forbade her from running. And said that, she, I forget, they accused her of treason or something like that and didn't allow her to run. But her ideas are very popular. So there would be a challenge in terms of whether the culture is ready to make this shift to something that's more of a limited government, free market system, which they haven't had even before Hugo Chavez. They didn't have it. And so it would be a big shift. But I think it's a chance they have to take because the status quo is unsustainable.
Let me ask you about also an idea now circulating in Washington about taking on these drug smuggling boats. There have been questions about the constitutionality of these strikes by the Trump administration on these drug boats. U.S. Senator Mike Lee has now introduced a bill called the Cartel Mark and Reprisal Authorization Act, suggesting essentially that one way to handle this would be to authorize U.S. privateers essentially to go after these kinds of drug boats. Here's a quote from the senator. He says, "The Constitution provides for letters of marque and reprisal as a tool against the enemies of the United States. Cartels have replaced corsairs in the modern era, but we can still give private American citizens and their businesses a stake in the fight against these murderous foreign criminals." Unquote. And Mary, I wonder what you make of that idea. I mean, sometimes you've heard this idea broached. We should have letters of marque in the digital domain, that we should authorize, the U.S. should authorize private hacking groups essentially to go fight in cyberspace against foreign hacking groups. But the difficulty of that in my mind is always that cyberspace is it's not quite an exact analogy to the high seas, where here we have something that looks more like the old privateer model of authorizing a U.S. defense contractor to go out and see if they can go capture some of these drug boats.
Well, I guess it sort of depends on what you think the mission is, what you think you're going to accomplish. I mean, Donald Trump began by bombing these drug boats, and he said that he was doing this because he was concerned about drugs, illegal narcotics coming into the U.S. But fentanyl doesn't come from Venezuela for the most part. It comes across the Mexican border. It comes from Asia. So there was always a little bit of a disconnect between what he said he was trying to do and what he could actually accomplish bombing these boats. And I think now he's kind of shifted that. He said, well, the cocaine is very dangerous for people. But again, cocaine comes into the U.S. in a lot of different ways, including across the southern border and from the Pacific. So the idea that you're going to stop the flow of drugs when you have such a strong demand for using drugs in this country, I think is not realistic. On the other hand, if he's trying to cut off money going to the regime because he wants regime change and he wants to turn Venezuela into a democracy again, that's a more defensible position. But quite obviously, it hasn't been enough to achieve what he wants to achieve, which is why he now needs to look at bombing the dock. So I'm not sure what Mike Lee is trying to accomplish. He considers himself a free market person and a constitutional person, but there's nothing in the Constitution about drug prohibition. I mean, when we did alcohol prohibition, we actually had to make a constitutional amendment for it. So the question for me would be, if he lets loose these privateers to go after drug boats, fine, but is that going to bring us any closer to an end to narcotics use in this country? I don't see it.
No, but it could perhaps have a similar effect of putting a crimp on money flows to these cartels that are in all sorts of ugly businesses other than drug trading. And I guess one thought is that it might do so in a way that is a force amplifier instead of having a significant, serious chunk of the U.S. Navy down there and sending those military assets after these speedboats in the Caribbean. You could have the U.S. Navy, out around Taiwan or in the Middle East, or a place where the kind of serious hardware that the Navy brings to bear, it could be maybe a better use while still offering some sort of deterrent above and beyond what the Coast Guard and so forth can provide.
And when drugs continue to flow over the southern border and in through the Pacific, are you also going to deputize privateers in those places? I'm taking this to its logical conclusion. I don't see it as a solution for either removing Nicolás Maduro or ending drug use in this country.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button. And we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.